can be only one!
There can be only one? That must mean one thing. Let's take a look back at all 5 Highlander films. Yep, you heard me right. There are 5 Highlander films and a TV series, which I'm not covering in this video because I gotta sleep at some point. I just rewatched all 5 films over the last few days, and I'm convinced after number 1, the others only exist as some form of complex, decades-long, Hollywood-based money laundering scheme. They get real bad, real quick. The first film has a definitive ending, they all lost money at the box office, and none of them were well received critically on release in the US. So just how the hell did we go on to get 5 movies in this franchise? One of which is legitimately in contention for being one of the worst direct sequels ever made. Let's start at the very beginning. Oh, this is probably going to be a long one, seeing as we're covering a whole 5 films and I rant a whole lot about Highlander 2. By Highlander 3 I'm seeing conspiracy theories everywhere, and by Highlander 5 I've given up the will to live. So on screen right now are the timestamps for each film if you want to skip to that one. Highlander is a 1986 British fantasy adventure directed by Russell Mulcahy, who also directed The Shadow, which I reviewed only 2 or 3 weeks ago. The genesis for the film came about whilst the writer Gregory Wyden was a student at UCLA doing an undergrad writing assignment for his screenwriting class. He based his initial draft on Ridley Scott's The Duelists, with Wyden saying of the inspiration, "The idea of the story was basically a combination of a riff on The Duelists, guy wants to finish a duel over years, and a visit I made both to Scotland and the Tower of London armour display, where I thought, what if you owned all of this? What if you'd worn it all through history and were giving someone a tour of your life through it?" That scene is basically in the movie. After reading his assignment, his tutor suggested he send it to an agent. Wyden subsequently sold what was to become the first draft of the Highlander for $200,000. I bet we wish we could all sell our homework for 200 grand. The initial draft of the script differed hugely from the one we got on screen, being more dark and violent, with MacLeod being more brooding and tortured by the years of violence he has witnessed, and there being no final gathering and prize the Immortals are fighting over, the film being a singular battle in a much wider war between the Immortals. On release, the movie was a financial failure, only gaining back $21.9 million on a budget of $19 million, being a success in the UK and Europe both commercially and critically, but failing on both fronts in the US. It holds a 69% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the consensus being that people hate Highlander because it's cheesy, bombastic and absurd, and people love it for the same reasons. I've seen Highlander on numerous occasions, yet going into this I had only a few definitive memories in my mind of it. The line "there can be only one", the fact Sean Connery is a Scottish person playing a Spaniard and Christopher Lambert is a Frenchman playing a Scottish person pretending to be an American for most of the film, and the amazing fight scenes where people get their heads chopped off. So I was really shocked when the film opens with an epic 10-minute sword fight where like 50 cars explode, a guy gets his head chopped off, and we see the quickening all in the opening 10 minutes. I would have sworn the film opened with Connor MacLeod dying at the clan battle, coming back to life, and then Ramirez training him. Kurgan then killing Ramirez, who I thought was in way more of this than he actually is too. He's in 4 scenes max, with the death of Ramirez then introducing us to the quickening, before we time jumped forward to New York and the Gathering, where we got a bunch more sword fights between Connor and Kurgan and various other Immortals. In other words, I remembered this film being in chronological order. But no, that's the first thing that jumped out at me about the Highlander on this rewatch. The plot is all over the place, pace-wise and narratively. The opening is an epic sword fight that would be most movies' climax, and we have no idea who either of these people are. Then we are introduced to the main character in a flashback. The plot carries on in this fashion for its whole runtime, jumping between present day and the past, so I see why I got so confused as to what the plot actually was for this. Also, pace-wise, it makes this film kind of slow in the middle compared to what maybe we would usually be used to. A modern action film normally opens by introducing the characters, then sprinkling action set pieces throughout the narrative every 15 to 20 minutes or so. Highlander opens on a climactic fight scene, has one or two small fights that randomly pop up, and then closes on another climactic fight scene, with pretty much the whole of the second act just being narrative setup for who Connor MacLeod is and the battle between the Immortals. That's not to say it is boring, because it is not. It's actually quite fast paced, with the modern era story and then the flashback origin story being interwoven together well, even if it kind of leaves large and fairly obvious plot holes sometimes. Not that these ever subtract from my enjoyment of this film. It's a fairly unique take on the genre, and one that most filmmakers wouldn't have taken. The other thing that will jump out straight away is Christopher Lambert is an awful actor. He has no emotional range. He just looks perpetually confused on screen. Added to that, his accent is all over the place. Occasionally he sounds mildly Scottish. Mildly. But for the vast majority of it, he sounds exactly like someone who only just learnt how to speak English and isn't quite sure how to pronounce any words, never mind in a Scottish accent. Which is not a surprise, because guess what? Lambert got the part after the director, Russell Mulcahy, was flipping through a magazine and saw Lambert and thought he looked perfect for the part. The small detail that he didn't actually speak English didn't put him off, and he actually hired Lambert based purely on his look. Lambert then spent months having 8 hours of tutoring, 4 hours of English in the morning, and 4 hours of swordsmanship in the afternoon to prepare for the part. The other members of the cast are fantastic though. Connery as the Spaniard Ramirez, who is actually a 2,500-year-old Egyptian, sounds exactly like Sean Connery, with zero fucks given about his accent, but he is, like Sean Connery in most films, really very good. But the show stealer is Clancy Brown as the Kurgan. He's just so deliciously evil throughout and steals every scene he appears in, being both menacing but at the same time also being mild comic relief, a little bit like an 80s Bond villain.
From the dawn of time we came, moving silently down through the centuries, living many secret lives, struggling to reach the time of the gathering.
Connery recorded that dialogue in his bathroom. That's why it's so echoey, and the producers just didn't care because it was good enough and they wanted to save money. Which is the other thing that hit me rewatching this. At times this film is stunningly beautiful and looks like real money was spent on it. From the stunning vistas of the Scottish Highlands to the rat-like neon maze that is New York City, with Mulcahy giving the film a very distinctive directorial style borrowed from music videos. The climactic battle between MacLeod and the Kurgan looks exactly like it could be from an 80s MTV video, with the protagonist and antagonist silhouetted against a vast candy-coloured warehouse window. It looks pretty stunning, and at other times it looks so cheap. Like in this scene here, it is so obvious that Clancy Brown is wearing a makeup scar on his neck. There aren't a huge amount of action scenes in Highlander, but the ones we do get are quite epic and are clearly where the majority of the film's budget was spent. Like I said previously, the first fight goes on for around 10 minutes and sees about 50 cars explode. A castle falls to pieces in another, and the climactic fight sees a rooftop collapse and flood around MacLeod and the Kurgan before they fall through the roof into the MTV music video scene. The practical effects used to make all this happen absolutely hold up, although the effects for the quickening don't hold up quite as well. All while this is going on, Queen is pumping above it because yep, they did the soundtrack for this film, with some absolute classics such as Who Wants to Live Forever and A Kind of Magic being used. I rarely talk about soundtracks because I'm not that musically inclined, but I know when a soundtrack adds to the experience of a film, and this is one of those times. So that was The Highlander, which I can absolutely see why it has become such a cult classic. Put aside it's been a favourite of mine for decades at this point, it is a definite unique directorial style, fast pace, an interesting premise, and narrative, and some absolutely epic 80s action scenes, all with some of the most baffling casting choices of all time thrown in for good measure. Oh, and Queen did the soundtrack, which is always a bonus. Even though the first Highlander movie wrapped up its self-contained story in a very definite tight bow at the end, 5 years later we got Highlander 2: The Quickening, which is highly regarded, or should that be lowly regarded, as one of the worst movies ever made, being a rare holder of a 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. So is it as bad as its reputation suggests? Let's take a look back and see.
Okay, now let me just see if I can get this straight. You're mortal there, but you're immortal here until you kill all the guys from there who have come here, and then you're mortal here. Unless you go back there, or some more guys from there come here, in which case you become immortal here. Again.
Something like that.
Yep, this movie makes one of the cardinal cinema sins in my eyes. It tries to explain the unexplainable. The original movie had a fairly simple premise. Immortals exist, they fight each other. When only a few remain, they will feel some pull to a far off and distant land where they will fight until there is only one left, and he will claim the prize. Now, I am not the kind of person who pearl clutches at movies butchering the law for fictional characters in films, but I do expect them to stay internally logically consistent within themselves. So let's explain exactly why this movie is so logically inconsistent with what came before, and even within its own plot, and is an absolute train wreck of a moving picture. Text card to open Act 1. We all know I love those, so we are off to a great start. The year is 2024, and in 1999 the world's ozone has been so depleted that a shield has been placed over the world to protect it from solar radiation, but some suspect that the ozone layer has actually repaired itself. So it's a near future commentary on what was at the time a present day problem. So far okay, I guess. This is plot A, essentially. We open the actual movie with MacLeod still played by Christopher Lambert as an old man, which straight away in the opening scene contradicts everything we knew about him from the first film. He was immortal and won the Gathering at the end of that film, which meant he was essentially immortal forever. He won the prize. He was the only one. Then we get a flashback to the planet Zeist, and Ramirez and MacLeod are rebels leading a rebellion against Captain Katana, played by Michael Ironside. They lose the rebellion and are sentenced to being sent into the future on the planet Earth, where they will become immortal but must fight all the other criminals that the planet Zeist has sent to Earth until there is only one. Yeah, they explain the immortals and they are aliens. This is plot B. The last one standing will have a choice to make, either stay on Earth and age and die gracefully, or return to the planet Zeist and his crimes will be forgiven. Now this raises several important questions. How the fuck are Ramirez and MacLeod known as Ramirez and MacLeod on an alien planet, and MacLeod is even known as the Highlander? Do they have Scottish Highlands on the planet Zeist? How, when they got to Earth, did they not recognise each other, as they'd been friends for years on Zeist? And why were they born as human babies and had childhoods and forgotten they were alien criminals sentenced to fight to death in some sort of bizarre battle royale? All of which becomes even more mind-bendingly baffling about 4 scenes later, because all of a sudden, Captain Katana decides to send 2 minions into the future to kill MacLeod. Even his minions say this when he orders them to do it.
But I thought you said MacLeod was mortal and will never return.
Do me a big favor, Corda. don't think.
He's an old man now. He'll be dead in a couple of weeks.
I don't care. Find him for me. Kill him.
Yes, exactly. He will die in a few weeks. Just leave him. What is your motivation here to kill him when he's so close to actual natural death after he's been on Earth for over 500 years at this point? There's no logical in-film reason, or just any logical reason anywhere in the universe for this at all. So back to the original point here, the porcupine guys appear on Earth as fully grown porcupine guys with future tech. In other words, they aren't reborn as babies from a human mother's womb, remembering nothing like McCloud and Ramirez supposedly were. Add to that, McCloud obviously kills the two minions in an alright action set piece. They actually legitimately stole the flying skateboard idea straight from Back to the Future, by the way. The first guy's death turns McCloud back into a young man, which had this porcupine dude just stayed back on the planet Zeist, McCloud would have been dead in 2 weeks. The second quickening ends the first act and directly leads us into the opening of the second act, with the most inexplicable part of this plot, because as McCloud is experiencing the quickening, he screams Ramirez's name, and that causes a bolt of lightning to bounce off the atmospheric shield and deflect to Glencoe, Scotland, and Ramirez appears. This is never explained. They even said earlier in this film, if you have your head removed from your neck, that's it, you are dead. Otherwise you are immortal. But apparently no. Act 2 is a bit of a drag, actually. We see McCloud start to investigate the shield that circles the Earth, which it turns out he built with the help of another guy. Yep, McCloud, an antiques dealer in the last film, built an atmospheric shield to protect Earth from solar radiation. But at this point, that's the least stupid plot beat so far. As it turns out, John C. McGinley is the boss of the SHIELD Corporation, and he's in fact hiding the reality that the shield is now pointless and not needed, which McCloud's new girlfriend, Louise, who is a terrorist hell-bent on destroying the shield, already suspected. McCloud met her as an old man, turned into a young guy and screwed her in an alleyway all within 5 minutes of this film. That's the level of picture we are dealing with here. Captain Katana decides he's the only man that can kill McCloud, so he also transports himself to Earth, where he crash lands through a subway train roof, takes control of it, and drives it at over 700 of whatever this speed is meant to be, because this train is clearly going incredibly slowly, and the footage is just sped up, and yep, this is it for action in the second act. The third act opens with Katana joining forces with the evil corporation because he correctly suspects that McCloud will attack the shield, which he does. Ramirez, just as inexplicably as he appeared, literally disappears in a flash of light and fire, equally as unexplained as his actual appearance in this film. The actual real-life reason he does appear is because Sean Connery and Christopher Lambert had become good friends in real life, and Lambert refused to sign up to the project unless Connery was brought back. What follows is a bunch of fairly poor, in comparison to the first film, action scenes and sword fights, although both Lambert and Ironside were injured filming them. Lambert losing part of a finger and Ironside suffering a chipped tooth, resulting in McCloud killing Katana, destroying the shield, kissing Louise, and everyone living happily ever after. Yeah, this plot is a hot mess of festering dog shit. Allegedly the plot is such a mess because this movie was shot in Argentina. Partway through the shoot, Argentina suffered one of its semi-annual recurring periods of economic chaos and hyperinflation, meaning the Investors and Completion Bond Company took control of the film from the director, Russell Mulcahy, and changed the story. I've covered a lot of films where the studio has interfered, but those films have a nugget of quality at the centre of the plot, and you can see where the studio ruined it. This plot is irredeemable. It just makes no sense at all in terms of the story that came before, but even more importantly, doesn't make any sense within its own narrative. Nobody, has any logical motivation for the things they are doing throughout, and most of the things that do happen are contradictory to things that happened already. The two plots, the evil corporation plot on Earth and the Immortals or Aliens plot, have no reason to exist within the same narrative together, and in fact the two acts are, for all intents and purposes, like two films have been randomly cut together, when some intern dropped unprocessed film on the cutting room floor and mixed them up, before uncomfortably combining into one in the third act. Convoluted would be an understatement. Neither has enough narrative oomph to actually exist separately too. There really is nothing to grab hold of plot-wise here. Lambert himself obviously sensed this was a festering turd and tried to get out of the film towards the end of shooting, but couldn't due to contractual reasons. Russell Mulcahy, the director, actually walked out of the film's premiere 15 minutes in. Even the acting is pretty special, and by special, I mean awful. At least Christopher Lambert can clearly speak English this time, but he's still got the emotional acting range of a plastic mask. Michael Ironside is a fantastic actor, but here he isn't just chewing the scenery, he appears to have snorted all of the cocaine in Argentina and is gurning madly throughout with a wild manic energy only the truly drugged or insane can muster, even going as far as making his voice as deep as possible to sound like Orson Welles, a fact he now deeply regrets apparently. John C. McGinley seems tame in comparison, but is himself also chewing every piece of scenery in arm's reach. Sean Connery is basically given nothing at all to do except buy a new suit. That's not to say this film doesn't have its positive points though. The budget here was an increase on the original being $34.5 million, although it only recouped $15.6 million at the box office, and that increased budget has been put to great use in parts. There are some fantastic miniatures, matte painting, sets and practical effects on show. Russell Mulcahy's distinctive style of direction and cinematography are also very much to the fore, giving New York a very Blade Runner-esque feel to it, which really does sell the dystopian future they were going for. So does Highlander 2 The Quickening deserve its reputation as one of the worst movies ever made? Yes, because obviously the plot is an absolute train wreck, and no, because there is enough here admittedly largely rubbernecking at the ensuing train wreck unfolding before your eyes, but it's never boring, and I have to admit, I kind of have a soft spot for this. How are we at Highlander 3, released 3 years after Highlander 2 in 1994. The first movie is great but lost money. The second is genuinely one of the worst movies ever made, if entertainingly bad, and lost even more money, and yet here I am only halfway through the Highlander series. Is this entire series a massive Hollywood money laundering scheme? It's the only explanation I can think of for its continuation. So let's take a look back at Highlander 3. For my first evidence that this entire series is in fact a massive decades-long Hollywood-based money laundering scheme, not only did this movie get made, it got a similar sized budget to Highlander 2. Yet someone put up $34 million for Highlander 3 to get made. Do you want to know an entirely unsurprising fact? Do you? Do you? By some miracle, it was the only Highlander film to make a tiny profit at the box office, but was an absolute critical bomb, only earning back $36.7 million and holding a nosebleed-inducing 5% on Rotten Tomatoes. After rewatching it for the purposes of this video, I am not that surprised either. Its main point of note being that it entirely retcons Highlander 2 from canon and is really the true sequel to Highlander, starting where that film ended and continuing the story of Connor MacLeod, retconning in the fact 3 more immortals were alive and trapped in a cave in Japan for 400 years, meaning they missed the gathering, and so therefore MacLeod must once again return to New York and claim the prize. That being the biggest problem with this film. It's essentially a rehash of the first one, just nowhere near as good, with some sorcery / Eastern mysticism thrown in, but everything that made the first great removed. Russell Mulcahy was replaced in the director's chair by Andrew Morahan, and so Mulcahy's genuine directorial eye for style has gone, and instead being replaced by someone who seemed to think just changing the colour gradient in post to blue would achieve the same result. Gone are the practical effects of the first 2 films to be replaced by mid-90s digital ones, so they are painful and jarring to your eyes. Digital effects from this era just haven't aged well at all. The action from the first 2 are also notably toned down here, with not one set piece really sticking out in my mind as being memorable. Ramirez is at least dead now. Drawback to that, no Sean Connery, but we do get Christopher Lambert, who by film 3 in the series is almost fluent in the English language, and the Kurgan Standing character, brilliantly played by Clancy Brown in the first movie, is played by Mario Van Peebles here, who in the annals of 90s action movie hero actors wishes he was even Z-list. He also for some bizarre reason talks like this.
And he owes me for all those years.
Throughout the entire runtime of this film, I think it is meant to be menacing and evil, but is just ridiculous, and had me questioning whether he was trolling the director about halfway through. So that was Highlander 3, a movie I honestly am convinced only exists because the Russians needed some drug money cleaning. It is at this point in the series the only explanation, because it is not good, and honestly, I'd recommend Highlander 2 ahead of this, because as bad as the plot is, I could never say that it was boring, unlike this one. Yep, that's where we are at in this review. My usually well-researched factoids have been replaced by insane conspiracy theories. Only 2 more movies to go at least. Highlander 4 Endgame is obviously the 4th film in the Highlander franchise, being released in the year 2000. The first to introduce elements of the TV series, and the final movie to receive a theatrical release. Exactly why will become painfully apparent in a moment. The 3rd Highlander movie had actually been put into production to take advantage of the popularity of the TV series, which ran for 6 seasons, but had made the interesting choice of foregoing including any elements of the TV series within it, choosing to keep the 2 entities separate. The 4th film was meant to act as a bridge between the TV series, the film series, and a new spin-off TV series focusing on a female immortal protagonist. But due to numerous production issues surrounding cast availability and the new series being cancelled due to low ratings after only 1 season, this was shelved, and the production company New Dimension shitting the bed and cutting back their theatrical plans for the picture. So it will come as no surprise to find this was once again a giant commercial and critical turd, earning only $15.9 million on a budget of $25 million and holding an 11% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I'm just gonna bury the lead here, this is the worst of the movies so far. I'm amazed this got a theatrical release. It looks exactly like a made-for-TV movie and or pilot for a TV series. The effects and acting are as equally cheap as each other, and the plot. Yeah, the plot is somewhat incomprehensible if you haven't seen the TV series. I even watched the producer's cut of the film, which adds back in 12 minutes of exposition to make the plot somewhat comprehensible to someone who hasn't followed that series. But there are so many elements here thrown in that are incongruous, to what has gone before in the film franchise, but I was still somewhat confused and had to resort to Google for answers. The story largely relies on a series of cliches to drive it forward, with most of our cast just having very little in the way of motivation to do anything they are doing. The flashbacks also seem wedged in here rather than being a natural part of the story. We even get not one, but 2 fake out deaths, which are the cheapest narrative plot device known to man in my book. Female immortals are introduced for the first time, and by female immortals I really mean female, as only one is featured here. Christopher Lambert looks old and tired throughout this, and it's no surprise when he sacrifices himself at the end and finally dies, but his Scottish accent is somewhat passable in parts at least. Bruce Payne is the bad guy Jacob Kell, an immortal that killed MacLeod's mother and refuses to follow the rules of the game. How he has so many acolytes is never even mildly explained, especially seeing as he kills them at the drop of a hat and on seeming whims. Anyone who has seen Payne's performance in Dungeons & Dragons knows exactly what to expect here. Absolutely no scenery is safe from him chewing it. Donnie Yen makes a small cameo in this as a Chinese immortal fighting Duncan MacLeod, seeing as he also designed the fight choreography. The rest of the cast range from entirely passable like Adrian Paul, who plays Duncan MacLeod, to did they actually just get whoever was passing by to read that line of dialogue. Like Highlander 3, this is largely very boring, to the point that I started mopping my floor halfway through this, just to entertain myself. It is that dreary. There's just nothing to really latch onto here. Action, plot, acting or train wreck movie making. So that was Highlander 4 Endgame, a movie I suggest you skip entirely unless you are some sort of maniac who enjoys being bored shitless. Or like me, bought it in a bargain bin for $1, just one more to go, and if rumours on the internet are to be believed, it's even worse than this one. I've made it. I've outlived watching the entire Highlander film series. I think they should come as some sort of lifetime achievement award, seeing as these movies get awful towards the end, and the 5th in the series is by far the worst. But let us take a look at why this even exists. Straight after the dismal failure of Highlander 4, the producers obviously had another pile of cash they desperately needed laundering, so wanted to make a 5th in the series. Initially, they approached Christopher Lambert to come back, even though they'd literally just killed him off. But he said he wanted lots of cash to do it, so they turned to Adrian Paul, who also told them to fuck off because he saw Highlander 4. The rights changed hands a few times, and eventually they managed to get Adrian Paul to agree to come back for a producer's credit, and I'm sure a fair slice of a $13 million budget. The film failed to attract anyone willing to release it theatrically, so it ended up straight to TV on Sci-Fi. Look, I just spent the last 3 days ploughing through this entire franchise, and I've probably written close to 5,000 words already, so let's not beat about the bush here. Only watch this if you hate yourself. I'm just gonna play a clip of this film and you will see why we have not had any Highlander films after this one, which is merciful, because this was meant to launch a trilogy. I swear I haven't done anything to this footage, I haven't touched it. The god-awfulness is all the work of this film. It is terrifying how far this franchise has fallen from the heights of the first one.
And you pissed it away.
Have a nice day.
The female Anna. She's not for you.
What's Anna got to do with this?
Nothing. Everything. Nothing. It's time for me and you to dance.
That outfit?
Foreplay.
I'm actually speechless as to how goddamn awful everything here is. It's like a really, really shitty Doctor Who episode, but somehow way worse than even that. I quite often shoot things for this channel and never release them because they don't even meet my bare minimum requirements, and yet someone, somewhere, working on a $15 million project thought this was going to launch a whole trilogy of films. I can't really say much more about Highlander 5 The Source, other than I've seen it twice now, and that is twice more than anyone should have watched this. So that was the Highlander film franchise, from start to inglorious finish. How we ever managed to get 5 films in this series will remain a money laundering mystery for all time, seeing as the first had a definitive ending and lost money, as did pretty much all the sequels that followed. Well, this has been a little bit of a labour of love because I had to watch 5 movies and it's taken like 2 or 3 days of recording, and I dread to think how long this is going to take to edit. So please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and if you've made it to the end of this, you're a hero. Hi, it's Future Vietnam Cooking, editing Vietnam Cooking, and we have a postscript this week because whilst I was finishing editing this video together, they announced that Henry Cavill would be signing on in a reboot of the Highlander franchise. I wonder just how much money this film will lose at the box office. Probably a lot, but man, I am so down for this because I really like Cavill as an actor and obviously have some bizarre love for this franchise and would love for it to be the success that it deserves.